think I gave the wrong instructions then. I told them that. Oh no, I'm good.
Everybody registered on Zoom, and then whoever shows up here, we ask them.
Okay, right. Oh, I love the yellow loop of paper. That's my favorite.
Just an opportunity to
Glad that you could come in person. I have to be seated on the other side, but I'll come and chat with you in a bit.
Can we see who's connected?
I'm not sure, just because we're in screen sharing, I'm not sure how much we can do. I mean, if you want to like log in.
No, I was just saying how many
computer.
Yeah.
Because I'm kind of curious too, because we can like see the chat and stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good.
Good use of my powers.
It's great. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, but wait, real powers. Where'd you put pocket paper?
Just make a little pile out of it. It's on a tablecloth. We can
Throw it at the audience.
All right. Hey folks, we're just about to open up the meeting now and get started. I'm talking to the folks behind me. I hope that's all right with everyone.
We're good.
All right, good evening. I'll just give a few seconds for you to connect. Welcome in, get comfortable everybody. Nice to see you on this rainy Thursday. And I say see you because we are running this as a meeting, so you can feel free to also at any point when you want to jump in with a question or comment, turn on your camera. And I'll officially get us started. So good evening. Today at For Space, the GRAFT Collective presents recipes for the suspension of space-time, a food preservation and mail art project created as practitioners and residents with conversations in contemporary art. We are streaming to YouTube live from Concordia University's For Space, located on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. At For Space, we facilitate daily activities that investigate what Concordia community members and their collaborators are working on, especially in terms of research. And to that end, we are happy to have been invited by Maya Oppenheimer, SICA convener, to host this series of conversations. So I'll just re-mention that we're running this particular iteration as a meeting. It's a bit of a workshop, so we'd love for you to jump in, and you know how, because you're familiar with Zoom by now, presumably, so feel free to raise a virtual hand, unmute yourself once you've been called upon. Turn on your video, otherwise the chat is activated. And I'll mention again, for those of you joining us live in person in the space, just to my left, we have set up a screen for you with a microphone. So if you want to jump into the conversation, just walk up to that screen. You'll be able to unmask, use the mic so that the folks on Zoom can hear you and make your comment or question that way. Okay, without further ado, my pleasure to pass it over to you, Maya. Welcome in.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anna. I'm going to do my best to remember where to look. This is a new capacity in my convener this year for Conversations in Contemporary Art. This is my third year as convener, and the platform itself has been running since around 2012. It runs out of the MFA program in the Department of Studio Arts at Concordia University. And it is a free event series that seeks to connect our students and faculty and interested members of the public with a variety of writers, curators, artists, designers, and educators to talk about research, as Anna said, to talk about practice, to talk about critical ideas. And this is the first time this year that we have been able to welcome you into the SICA space in person as well as on Zoom. This is our first hybrid event. So thank you to Fourth Space and to the GRAFT Collective for being up to this kind of technological challenge, and to our studio audience, both home and on campus. I'm looking over here through a screen because I know there are people sitting on the other side. So we are on campus. As Anna intimated, we are on Kanien'kehá:ka land in downtown Tiohtià:ke. You can see passersby and the street behind me. And this is the closest I'll ever feel to being on Much Music. I am not a video DJ. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Studio Arts. And that's what connects me professionally as well as personally to Tiohtià:ke. Tiohtià:ke is a Kanien'kehá:ka term for what is also known as Montréal, and also Muniang in Algonquin. And I want to draw everybody's attention for this Zika event to an event that took place via this place, via the technologies that we're using to stay connected during COVID, because even though some of us are on site, many of us are still joining in a distance fashion. But I'm referring to an event that was hosted also by Fourth Space at 4 o'clock yesterday, which is the launch of the Indigenous Futures Research Center. And I'm going to put a link to it in the chat, but I wanted to mention it as we acknowledge where we are in relationship to land and the traditional keepers of the land. Because this new initiative is a response to the Indigenous Directions Action Plan that the Concordia University provost administrations and affiliates are also held to. The 6th is a call to action to start an Indigenous-led and focused research center. And that was launched to mark the growth of research creation happening with students, faculty, and community connections that center Indigenous community knowledge and interests and dreams. So do know that that is something that we can connect to as well. Now, our hosting this afternoon, is a warm one and connected to ideas of relationality, of identity, of how we stay connected, how we share knowledge, how we form identity and intimacies. I'm talking about the many interests that the GRAFT collective hold. The GRAFT collective not only hold many interests, but they consist of many people, 5 individuals who are all joining us either in person or via Zoom, because we also are welcoming them from different cities, different states and provinces, and thus also different countries. So they are formed in 2014 and were all based in Albuquerque, New Mexico at that point in time, are now dispersed, but still connecting and knitting and hosting conversations, which is part of what you're going to be not only acting today, but also discussing conceptually. Because one of the reasons that we met was because GRAFT Collective submitted a proposal to be the first conversations in contemporary art, practitioners in remote residence. Now, the Conversations in Contemporary Art platform had to go remote when everything went remote or stopped when the pandemic spread in 2020 in March. And as coordinator and convener of the series, and also somebody who had some autonomy with how we use the budget, we were thinking about the theme radical hospitality, and also how can a lecture series or event series like SICA be responsive and accountable to its constituencies, being students, faculty, artists, locally, nationally, and internationally. So through this theme of radical hospitality, we started several initiatives, including microgrants for students. We invited practitioners of various media and persuasions and perspectives to talk about and problematize the idea of hospitality, especially when it's connected to an institution on Indigenous lands. But we also started this practitioners in residence. So GRAFT was the first, and it involved sending them some funding support, some logistical support, and opportunities to share their ongoing work over 2020 and 2021 with this eco platform. So now here we are in November 2021, and the collective is going to talk to us about what they've been up to, some of the challenges that they put forward through that work, and that they faced also logistically. Because remember, this residency took place over the first months of COVID, when the postal system in the US was not functioning properly. We can maybe have a conversation about when it does, but there were a lot of challenges, not only about emotional labor, but intellectual, conceptual labor, how we carry on practicing what we practice, and what that looks like during a pandemic. So on that note, I'm going to pass things over to GRAFT. I'm looking at Cecilia and Danny because they're here, but I also want to make sure everybody sees Jazmyn and Beth and Jessica, who are on the Zoom. I can see also some folks from our interested publics and in-house, so this is great. Thank you so much, everybody, for gathering. And thank you, GRAFT Collective, for cobbling together on Zoom and in person to share with us recipes for the suspension of space-time. Over to you all.
Well, thank you so much for that generous introduction. We're so excited to be here. The format of this talk this evening is going to be a hybrid presentation and workshop. So if you choose, we invite you to keep your hands and senses busy while we share our work by joining us in preparing a jar of lacto-fermented vegetables. We will be we'll be interspersing the format of an artist talk with directions for preparing a general salt ferment that's suitable for many types of vegetables. With the stages of this recipe, we'll also highlight some of the conceptual threads running through our physical and digital mail exchanges. We encourage you to take our directions with a grain of salt and trust your creativity, your personal tastes, and the contents of your own kitchen. So I'll start the introduction. My name is Jazmyn Crosby. I'm currently located in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which is the land of the Lenni Lenape.
My name is Danny Crouch. As you can tell, I'm currently located in Jojage.
I'm Cecilia McKinnon, likewise in Jojage, which is Kanien'kehá:ka land.
I'm Beth Hansen, and I'm in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which is Tiwa land.
And I'm Jessica, and I'm also in Tiwa land.
So as Maya said, GRAFT formed in late 2014, growing out of the DIY and music scene in Albuquerque, where we maintained an exhibition space from 2015 to 2018. The name GRAFT is meant to be a play on our commitments to interdisciplinary collaboration, hybrid practices, and eclectic approaches to sources, form, and material. Themes we've approached in the past curatorial and personal projects relate to questions of intimacy in public spaces, distortions of time and memory via technology and built environments, the often invisible labor of maintaining collective relationships and identities, and the operations of capitalist spectacle and cultural production. Our programming included exhibitions, performances, artist talks, workshops, walking tours, as well as collaborative events and installations, which extended between three or more spaces, working with our then neighbors, the Tannex and the Small Engine Gallery. The gallery itself is in the historic Bareilles neighborhood of Albuquerque. And as a side note, it's right on the Camino Real, which is the historic passenger and extraction route that connected colonial Spanish territories in New Mexico between the Oque-Owingeh Pueblo and Mexico City. This space has been used as an art and performance space kind of continuously for the past 30 years or so, changing managerial hands every so often. In 2018, several of us departed for other cities. And so we passed the gallery on to new stewards and shifted into a long distance relationship.
So one of the things that's come up a lot over the years for us, especially while we were running the space, is kind of the financial and social precarities, especially around being a DIY collective. And alongside that is a preoccupation with the care and maintenance of relationships being kind of the thing that holds the project together. So this became kind of a central focus of our own work, our installation and performance and event practice, but also is kind of always this through line running behind all of the other projects that we've taken on. One of the ways that this manifests is in food and food practices and food as a material. So we could think about food as a placeholder. It's the medium by which we kind of connect to others symbolically and literally and physically. But it's also kind of more performatively been a material that's really present in a lot of our work. So on the left hand of the slide here, I likewise don't really know where to look right now. The left part of the slide is a timeline that I was developing as part of the project, trying to trace all of the roles that food has played in our curatorial and installation practice since 2014. So sometimes that means building a giant piñata full of Jell-O. Sometimes it showed up as a bisected dinner table with a window in between, and visitors were invited to share a meal with a stranger on either side of the window. The image on the right is one of our more recent projects, kind of our first attempt at reconciling distance in 2019, Recipes for Disaster, which was a themed curated dinner party in Philadelphia where we came together for a few days, recreated a kind of monstrous amount of these mid-century gelatin recipes, and then paired them all with conversation cards. So attendees were invited to partake in this sort of bizarre food, and were also given cues to engage each other in conversation topics that are often very uncomfortable, related to questions about futurity, about climate change, about kind of social relationships and how we hold them. The project was aimed at opening space for thinking collectively about the idea of living in suspense and considering uncertain futures. So we were thinking about gelatin as a literal medium of suspension, but also something that stems historically from aspics, which are a really kind of old form of preserving food. Also using recipes from the Cold War era, referencing this culture of suspense and reconsidering the kind of idea of mutually assured destruction as a generation kind of growing up under the shadow of climate change.
So that brings us to what we've been working on in the last year. So we were really excited to see Sika's call for remote practitioners, and we were really honored to be selected to be the practitioners in remoteness. So our residency comprised this project that we just have been working on, a mail exchange centering around preservation of food, objects, relationships, and time. So using fermentation, pickling, drying food, the food became the basis for care packages and edible mail art. So these packages constituted a loose archive, including foodstuffs, recipes, letters, voicemails, video events, kitchen rags, USB drives, weird trash that we found, lots of other stuff. Recipes here become loose scores for time capsules, snapshots of our regional and intimate lives, and documentation of our efforts to reach each other across distance.
The project comprises 34 packages with 36 recipes. We used USPS and Canada Post between Montreal, Philadelphia, Albuquerque, Louisville, and Oakland. And the project was from September 2020 to February of 2021. These packages, the exchanges felt like old-fashioned forms of communication, but they were also one that was more tangible and tactile, or limited with carefully curated objects to share stories through sight, sound, and taste. We call them time capsules. Each package contained a table of contents that listed everything inside, including letters, photographs, objects of the camera, and packaging material that were often recycled from other sources, such as bubble wrap, leftover tissue paper, reused packaging tape with our strands of hair and dust collected, and newspapers. Oftentimes, each package also had embellishments on the outside, like dried leaves that were taped on or painted beet juice. We would receive the packages and document them and all of its contents using scanners and cameras, which allowed us to see the weathering, dirt-collected marks that were added during the many hands that touched these boxes in transport.
So this is a talk and also a workshop, so kind of moving towards the workshop end of it, thinking through lacto-fermentation. I just wanted to touch on the idea of food preservation as a suspension of time. So two of the ways that we approach this are pickling and also wild fermentation. When choosing to preserve food, you immediately start thinking in terms of scales of time. So there's days, there's weeks, there's months, there's years, and all of the different processes that you engage in are gonna kind of throw you different distances into the future imaginatively. So tonight we'll just talk a little bit about pickling versus wild fermentation. In our culture, we tend to use the term pickling really loosely. For our purposes today, I'm just going to distinguish pickling as brine pickling when it's preserved in a sealed vessel in a vinegar-based brine and pressure canned using heat. Pickling preserves vegetables by lowering the pH through the introduction of vinegar to a stable level, so making it more acidic, and then the pH stays static. Pickling and pressure canning are also a suspension into deep time. So you can pickle something and seal it and theoretically leave it on the shelf for years and it will be the same inside until you unseal the vessel. This is achieved by creating an airless and therefore lifeless environment. Wild fermentation, on the other hand, works by slowing time without bringing it to a halt. So wild fermentation includes many different processes, but it works generally on the scale of weeks or months, relying on organisms and natural yeasts present on your food and on your kitchen surfaces and on your hands. Today we'll be collaborating with lactic acid bacteria. There's over 200 varieties of lactic acid bacteria and they're everywhere. It's believed that it's the first bacteria that you come into contact with as a newborn human in the world. By introducing salt brine into the vegetables that we use today, we're gonna create an environment where different species of lactobacillus can thrive, and other decay-inducing organisms and enzymes cannot thrive. The bacteria will then, in this environment, the saline environment, eat the sugars off your food and produce lactic acid. So lactic acid is the byproduct that we're after as humans, as it's a natural preservative.
So part of the project was sending each other recipes, and this is kind of the recipe that we're going to be working on today, which is a vegetable ferment, a freestyle vegetable ferment. So let's get into the tools and stuff you'll need.
So if you are following along, this recipe requires vegetables of your choice. It can be really adapted based on what's at hand. A knife, a cutting surface, clean vessel, salt, some kind of weight, some kind of covering, and then optionally, if you want to be scientific about it, a kitchen scale or a mixing bowl. And we've brought materials to prepare a couple different recipes tonight. So we've chosen sweet potatoes for one recipe, and then we have sweet potato and garlic. And then we also have the materials for making just a regular sauerkraut. So the first step would be to just chop your chosen vegetables into spears, wedges, slices, or shreds. The size of these can vary based on the density of the vegetable, the time frame you're imagining, and the desired consistency. So for example, harder or denser vegetables, thicker slices will take longer, but you can also maintain a really nice consistency. So for the sweet potato, we went for spears. And then something like sauerkraut or softer vegetables, if you want something that's a softer consistency, you can slice it into thinner amounts.
So hopefully everyone's going to be chopping whatever's in front of you right now, or thinking about chopping what's in front of you. So as you're preparing your ingredients and thinking about this recipe, I want to talk about the context of fermentation. So humans have been fermenting food pretty much everywhere and pretty much forever across space and time. So there's this cool map that sort of shows you a very broad stroke of ingredients and microscopic collaborators. So fermentation practices are shaped by regional ingredients and regional climates and regional microbes. Traditional cultured foods become foundational to local culture, shaping the tastes and microbiomes of communities for generations. So I included a very incredibly abridged list of examples of fermented foods. There's some that are more recognizable maybe in a Western diet than others. But if you can think of any ingredient anywhere in the world, you probably find a ferment. So today we're working with lactobacilli, but others might involve other strains of bacteria or yeast or molds to ferment the food. So fermenting food is fundamental to human culture and connects us to each other and to our other non-human species as well. So people have been fermenting food and continue to ferment food today without refrigeration, without glass, without soap, without kitchen scales. So this can be like an incredibly low-tech practice and guided by your own tastes, and you can get improvisational with it, as people have been doing for most of human history. It's also important for us to note that for us, food practices are non-proprietary, and we don't own fermentation as artists or as people or even as a species, because there are animals that do ferment fruit in the wild as well, like elephants and monkeys, for example. So we invite you all to hold in your minds the idea of this recipe, this interval of time, as a score which briefly connects us to one another, creating a temporary and dispersed community with a life that is flourishing visibly around us. So recipe as score was a sort of guiding principle for us throughout this project. So we were thinking about recipe as an invitation to explore and improvise and experiment rather than prescriptive set of instructions. We were coming to a lot of these food preservation practices as total novices. So a lot of these recipe cards that we wrote were records of first attempts or failures or recipes that we just transcribed from family members or friends. We chose these kind of kitschy 1970s recipe cards as the format for these recipes because they recall a form of personal skill sharing that was maybe more common a generation ago, where a recipe isn't a script procedural, repeatable procedure, but something that is gained through shared personal knowledge or notes made during an experiment.
In addition to food-based scores, we sent each other recipes that were conceived of as scores that were more performative, ritualistic, or conceptual. So here you see a score for Gathering Distantly, which is one that I wrote and distributed. The score was sent out with a placemat, and each placemat was assigned a cardinal direction based on the collective member or recipient's position geographically. These placemats as a set are conceived of as an orientation device, which is used to help us face each other without telecommunication across vast distances. So participants are instructed to set a predetermined time to meet and then to position our bodies towards an imagined center point, keeping our minds focused on the directions and distances in between us. These placemats also came with natural dye recipes. So these are made from cotton, which is mordanted with soy milk, dyed with avocado pits and foraged elderberries variously, and then pieced.
So another major theme of our exchanges involved the careful consideration of all of these ingredients that came together. Their sources, histories, chemistry, and cultural associations, as Beth has already kind of pointed out. So right now, before we talk about ingredients in our work, we'll just look at the other main ingredients for this particular ferment, which is salt. The most precise way to brine your ferment is to calculate the brine by weight. So 3 to 5% is the standard range for a lacto-ferment. And as Celia has pointed out, salt slows down the reactions of lactobacilli. So think of a high percentage of salt for a longer fermentation process, or for a softer food item like tomatoes. A lower percentage of salt will encourage a quicker reaction for faster results and work on food or items like garlic more rapidly. The temperature of your kitchen matters here too. If your home is very warm, you should use a higher salt percentage. Also, the inverse would be true if your house is very cold. So for our crowd today, we'll do a more specific calculation. I'll go with 3%, which for a mass of, what do we have again?
I'm just going to go ahead and admit that I pre-measured the sauerkraut because I knew I was going to have busy hands. I wrote it down. I personally prefer to do a percentage because during the heat wave, especially in Montreal this summer, I had a couple of batches of things go bad when the kitchen temperature just skyrocketed over a period of days. Other people prefer to just work by eyeballing, so a tablespoon per quart of vegetable material. So for example, if you know you have a quart jar, just allocate a tablespoon of salt. Or if you're chopping something like kraut, just remembering to put a big pinch in every couple handfuls. So I'm going to use about 18 grams of salt in each of these. So I'm just going to go ahead and measure that.
So thinking through ingredients, I wanted to talk about salt. And one of the things that we did for this project was a score called the Dinner of Salt. For the dinner, I invited everyone from GRAFT and a live stream of the ocean to join me for a Zoom dinner and create an unsalted meal. And at the end of the, before we were able to salt the meal, I read a piece of writing, which I will read to us this evening. There are 3 to 4 salt shakers worth of salt in the human body, and without salt, you would die. If you are following along with our salt ferment recipe, please take a pinch of salt, put it in your mouth, and savor the taste. Salt is the only rock crystal that is consumed. The salt crystal, under a microscope, is square. It is the thing that is most commonly used in preservation processes, to make brine, to preserve, even to mummify. Salt offers sterilization, salt offers cleanliness, and salt makes water buoyant. The more I think about salt, the more difficult it becomes to extract it from life. There's something impossibly essential about salt. Salt is in the blood. Salt is electric, a transmitter between cells, critical for maintaining a heartbeat. The salt in the body cleans the little ocean inside of you, keeping your cells functioning, a host for bacteria and microorganisms. Evolution is historical and collaborative. Things only grow and change because they come into contact. The body is an ecosystem that lives on because of its collaborators. For much of human history, salt was literally currency. The history of salt is the history of labor. Soldiers were paid in salt. Human beings were sold for salt. Nations were made wealthy or poor, crumbled or succeeded because of salt. And now that salt is cheap and abundant, the whole thing appears like a hoax. Boiled salt water, to separate salt from the sea. And when people are angry, they are salty. And salt leaves the body as urine and sweat. Salt chemically allows for us to taste food and also enhances flavor. It is one of 4 flavors we can actually taste and not just smell. Salt circles are used to create safe space, and salt is thrown over the shoulder to ward off bad spirits. Let us take a moment now to cherish our time together with salt. I invite you to consider your salt this evening for your vegetables. Let it live on inside of you like a moving salt circle, keeping you clean and buoyant.
When talking about all of these recipes and experiencing their tastes and flavors, these 2 words are used interchangeably to describe food. However, they are not the same thing. Our perception of taste is based on various factors, including genetic and cultural background, exposure to foods. Taste receptors respond to the 5 taste profiles of sweet, salty, sour, bitterness, and recently added to the list, umami, which is often described as savory or meaty. And flavor is when you're using your olfactory receptors or your nose to distinguish specific foods. Taste receptors facilitate molecules of food to interact with saliva and make contact with taste receptors. This then sends signals in the brain to respond and send information to let us know if our food is poisonous, when our fruit is ripe, when food is spoiled, and in the case of spicy foods, the capsaicin, the active component of chili peppers that trick and signal our brains into believing that our mouth is burning. Olfactory receptors, visual, subjective, which is the perception of taste, trigeminal, which is hot, cool, and mechanical, all contribute to the perception of taste. There's also genetic variations and ethnic backgrounds that influence our perception. Cilantro is a perfect example, as it tastes like soap to some people and citrusy to others. And lastly, exposure to foods goes into a deeper look at ethnic backgrounds and upbringings and how a child might develop a liking to a food item that is only found in that region. During this project, I got to explore an ingredient known as Szechuan peppercorns for a recipe in making Szechuan chili oil. Szechuan peppercorn is not a spice, but rather a fruit that belongs to the citrus family, and the flavors in the seeds, husks, leaves, or barks of the Chinese prickly ash tree are used to make dishes such as mapo tofu and stir fries. Szechuan peppercorn is unlike the chemical response that we get from eating chili, like I had mentioned before, the capsaicin. Instead, our tongue receives a tingling and numbing sensation. This is responsible for the molecule called hydroxy-alpha-sanchol, which is found in the plant and is the reason for this chemical reaction. The sensation of tingling can actually be recorded in hertz through this mechanical vibration, and scientists have recorded up to 50 hertz of vibration that emit from the human lips after exposure to Szechuan peppercorns.
So while we talked, we've been integrating our salt into our kraut. With thinner slices or shreds, you can just kind of massage it in. And then we're going to need water as a medium for the kind of harder vegetables. One of the recipe books that we referred to the most, which was Sandra Elix-Katz's The Art of Fermentation, he actually describes kind of pounding harder vegetables in order to make them release their own juices too. We're not going to do that tonight. But you should be ready at this point to pack your vessel. So you want some kind of clean vessel. You can wash it with soap, wipe it down with vinegar. We're not canning these for a long period of time, so you don't need to worry about doing like a boiled sterilization. And what you'll do, I can see our kraut's kind of releasing some brine already, is start to just push the chopped pieces in really tightly. The shredded veggies should submerge in and emit their own liquid. And if they're very dry, when you've kind of packed the jar full and pushed it down with something, you can use a little bit of water. In the meantime, for my sweet potatoes, I'm just going to go ahead and put my measured salt into water. I'm gonna dissolve it, and then I'll just kind of push those under. The other thing about packing your vessel is that you want to use a weight to keep your vegetables submerged under the liquid. So this could be something like a bottle filled with water that fits inside the mouth of your jar. Some people use a Ziploc bag filled with water. You can use a leaf and kind of wedge it down on top. Or they also make specialty fermentation weights out of glass and ceramic that you can use that just fit right inside the mouth.
So I also want to point out the image on this slide are 3 huge jars of tomatoes that I tried to ferment last November. And I think I had them out in just like room temperature for about 2 weeks, and I tried them and they tasted like nail polish remover to me. So that was a failure. I did ship this to Jazmyn, and I think they're still in her house, and they've been there for a year, maybe uneaten.
Yeah, they're a year old, I guess, and I'm a little afraid of them.
So it's unclear whether like I maybe left them on the counter too long, or if it was just a salt issue, or if I just don't like fermented tomatoes. I don't know. It's an experiment. So while you guys are packing your vegetables in your vessels, I want to talk about microbes. So this project, as Maya mentioned, was conceived during 2020, during the sort of height of COVID lockdown and the kind of cultural response to COVID. So we were all just thinking a lot more about germs and about our own germs, about transmitting germs to other people, sanitizing surfaces. And so we just wanted to think more deeply through this project, think about maybe a more balanced relationship with microbes, because though when we think of germs, microscopic critters, we usually think of pathogens. So we're thinking about diseases, things that make us sick, or often with food, things that make our food go bad. But we wanted to think about like a more holistic view of our relationship with microbes. So part of that was, as we were packaging things in our packages and making food for each other, we're just thinking about how inevitably we would be interacting on a microbial level, sort of in the way that we would if we were sharing the same space. So kind of simulating intimacy by sharing germs with one another through long distance. I want to read this recipe card, which is a recipe for communing with your inner community. So for every 1 human cell in your body, there are 1.3 non-human cells. You are a walking, thinking, feeling, dreaming home to 39 trillion other living beings: bacteria, fungi, archaea, viruses. There are more genes in your person than there are stars in the observable universe. And it would take 9 million years to greet each individual. So just take a moment to think about that. Think about the fact that our bodies are entire complex ecosystems, that it's like an ongoing renegotiation between our cells and every other cell that we come in contact with. And it's a continually shifting relationships and borders with those. It also calls into question, what is an individual and what's community? Are we individuals or are we collectives? And it's also unclear who's thinking in this relationship, like who's thinking, who's dreaming, because there's more and more research that our microbiomes are affecting the way we feel and think. So as you're preparing this recipe, just think about the fact that your hands and your food are inevitably covered in microscopic life, and that to this recipe that's essential, and to trust your gut. So just to go into the topic of uninvited guests. So we are making food, and there are some things that we don't want to ingest. As long as your vegetables are submerged underneath the brine, you can trust that the lactobacilli are like taking charge, and they're making that a good environment where bad stuff won't grow. But you might observe, if you're making a ferment with a little bit less salt or with sweeter vegetables, or if you're at a warmer temperature, calm yeast might grow on top of your ferment, which is it looks like a white film with like bubbles trapped underneath it. It's harmless. It might not taste good to you. You can just scoop it off with a spoon. If you see mold growing on top, like if you have exposed vegetables bob up like above the brine, mold can grow there. So if you see anything fuzzy or colorful, it just means you have to throw out your ferment, because like the mold will send roots down through the whole jar and kind of ruin your whole thing. I pickled like 3 jars of peppers that I grew, and I didn't clean the like rims of the jars well enough, I think. So it came with its own mold spores and kind of ruined my ferment. And it was really sad. One thing you don't have to worry about is botulism. So I think often we think about jars, we think about food safety when we think of botulism. That's only a concern when you're making like heat canned food. So improperly made jellies or pickles, if there's not enough vinegar or sugar involved in those, then in that anaerobic environment, they can form botulism, or the bacteria can form a toxin. But that's not a concern with ferments because it's an aerobic environment because you're letting air in.
So here we have an example of some uninvited guests. This is one of the only glass objects that we lost during shipping, actually. It arrived from Philadelphia to Montreal, broken. This was a recipe for leftover pumpkin jam that unintentionally became the substrate for at least 2 kinds of terrifying mold. As a synchronicity that was sort of startling, this jar happened to be wrapped in several pages worth of obituaries. So this was during November of last year. Pre-vaccine pandemic, and it sort of became one of many moments over the last 18 months where the kind of coexistence of so much life alongside so much death became really, it was thrown into sharp relief.
So in considering the act of packing your container, we might discuss mail art as an extension of fermentation itself. Fermentation, pickling, canning, storing, all these things involve containing something and then opening it again later. When we buy food at the grocery store, for instance, we're unsealing a vessel that's traveled through others' hands in boxes and crates, often across borders. Most commodities in our lives are produced with parts manufactured in different places, shipped elsewhere for assembly, shipped again to be packaged, and then packed again in containers meant to streamline their distribution throughout a global economy. It is an attempt to discipline labor through the accelerated transactions of this globalized economy, but also a slow leaking cultural form. Containerization flows from shipping to housing to other forms of mobile and cheapened architecture. Our individual packages exist at the relative scale of microbes within this massive network of domestic and international shipping. So we prepare food for each other by sealing it into vessels and enclosing them into other vessels. Soft packaging, cardboard boxes, bubbles of suspended time, which move from my home to yours, and so on. We transmitted pickled sounds, videos, images, links, and texts via USB drives, a jar for holding ephemeral materials, a package of suspended information, but information that cannot communicate its origins necessarily. Which is to say, I guess, the conditions under which it was assembled, right? Packaged and shipped. So an interesting moment in all of this was when we had to make a game of lying on customs forms. Many of our recipes depend on living organisms to continue their fermentation, but only dead things are supposed to cross the border in this fashion. So in this score that you can see right now, Beth shared research around mail systems and customs for border crossing foods. It was really compelling to consider the levels of surveillance around our intimate exchanges, feeling the places where our daily lives intersect with major government agencies and globalized agricultural protocols. If national borders form a kind of vessel, artificial, social, and instrumentalized, our interests in preserving the seal melt away very quickly, and it kind of inverts our priorities. So it's nice to imagine that our sealed packages are themselves uninvited guests traveling along lines of trade.
I also wanted to add that during my research exploring Szechuan peppercorns, I found that from 1968 to 2005, USDA instituted a blanket ban on all citrus fruit from China because of a highly contagious bacteria called citrus cankers. Bacterial disease was actually hard to control, and it would infect US citrus crops. In 2005, USDA and FDA approved importation of Szechuan peppercorns after it would be heated to about 140 degrees Fahrenheit to kill off all bacteria. And it wasn't until 2007 that the dried peppercorns were allowed to be imported again, because it was never taken into account that the peppercorns were actually used dried. So it would have been completely harmless to begin with.
So at this point, you've created a time capsule. We have two in front of us, and our major part of the labor is done, and we're kind of passing it off to the lactic acid bacteria, and now they're at work on our behalf. So at this point, you would want to loosely cover your vessel. Usually I just do this with a clean napkin and a rubber band, like so. And you want it to have a permeable membrane for a couple of days so that local bacteria and yeasts can freely move in and out and start to form a stable community inside the jar. If you don't have a napkin, you can also just kind of loosely put a jar lid on and not screw it all the way on. You'll want to find a comfortable place for your ferment, so somewhere at room temperature or a little cooler and out of direct sunlight. And after 2 to 3 days under the light covering, and at first you should kind of check it often, because the first 2 to 3 days are when the bulk of the fermentation happens. It's kind of the most active time. It's the time when it is the most likely to bubble over or to emit a bunch of gases under its lid. But at some point you'll notice that it's sort of, if you can see the liquid brine, you'll see little bubbles starting to percolate up. With kraut or something that's got less brine but is still submerged, you would kind of want to just rely on your nose. And at a certain point, when it feels right to you, you'll want to change to a lid, let it continue fermenting, and then when it smells and tastes perfect, that's when you would move it into the fridge to keep it in a state of suspended animation.
As you all can see here, this is a photograph of fermented garlic honey. During this moment, I took a picture because it was at its most active peak fermentation process. You can see the effervescent bubbles that are emitting from this ferment. I was able to enjoy seeing the bubbles. This ferment was very active. It felt like a science project to me. One thing that I found really interesting about this fermentation recipe is that it used raw honey to ferment the garlic because of the enzymes, which is unlike infused honey, which uses honey that's already cooked. One thing that I feel like was a failure of this project was that I packed the honey filled to the brim, and I chose these lids. And what ended up happening was the honey started to seep out because it was so active. It was breathing and it was changing, and it was undergoing this change that, I was so new and unfamiliar to.
Yeah, so you want to give your jars room to breathe, definitely.
Let's take a second to think about time capsules. Since we were framing all of these packages in the realm of time capsules. So a time capsule is an attempt at preserving one's moment in time. As collective members living far from each other, these packages were an attempt to reach each other, to communicate our lives with each other, always a little out of sync, delayed, staggered. These packages offered a means of communicating and consuming the nuanced experiences of each other's lives. And while it's impossible to stop time, through lacto-fermentation, at least you can slow it down and create something new out of that slowness. In the case of seeds, it's a way for DNA to pause, to travel across the earth, to wait, to be protected until it's able to grow again. A time capsule often ends up being a failure, a collection of old trash imbued with the belief that communication with the future is possible, but so much is lost in translation. A time capsule is mostly for the person making it to archive their own experience, reflecting more on them than the actual translation of time. Many time capsules are essentially filled with old trash, things that once mattered to people of the past, but have largely fallen out of interest to people of the current moment. The amount of time we communicated between was pretty short, a couple of months rather than 100 years. We considered everything we sent to be time capsules, but always changing, fragile. We sent time capsules in the form of digital ephemera, an MP3 player with high school music, letters, flyers, leaves, found objects, recipes. Following is an excerpt of an audio recording that I had made in November 2020, and that Cecilia adapted to her environment to show a lag in time and a distance. First, I should say what day it is and what time. This was recorded, well, today it's November 6, 2020. And the time is 3 p.m., or it is noon, or it is 4:20 p.m., and it's very beautiful outside, and it still is. I am recording this in my studio.
So another important part of our thinking through this was thinking about like compost and landscapes in particular. So I'm going to read a little excerpt from an essay that I've been working on connected to this project entitled The Fermenting Landscape. Zooming out, in the northern neighborhood of Saint-Michel in Montréal, there was a limestone quarry, which was then a landfill and is now a park. This park is named after the German-born Canadian artist Frederick Bach, perhaps best known for the animated film The Man Who Planted Trees. Native grasses and trees grow like a furry mold over the slowly undulating hills of buried semi-viscous waste. Spherical off-white orbs pockmark the landscape, appearing as an amalgamation of fallen snowberries and beached escape pods from a starship. In the distance, communication towers sprout up from a vast and often unseen infrastructure, mirroring the root structures of aspen groves, whose underground network surfaces as individuated trees, growing up from a single multifaceted being. Perhaps these towers, themselves often disguised as trees, are what drop these uncanny berries across the landscape. The spheres act as biogas collectors, accumulating the methane and carbon dioxide emitted by the biodegrading and anaerobic factory beneath the surface of the park. This methane is then converted into another kind of energy for another kind of factory. Electricity from the transmuted gases can flow into the electrical grid, heat houses, and be used in fertilizers or as fuel for transportation. One storage container flows into another in order to power the engines of capital accumulation, so responsible for the mass shifting of topsoil and the production of this waste itself. An eerie view when we consider Roger Hooke's observation that mining and highway construction in the last 100 years has moved more earth than glaciers, wind, wave action, and plate tectonics combined. It's easy to remystify this process and to imagine that our economies and landscapes are natural phenomena and not a naturalized set of behaviors and social relationships, a particular way of generating and storing value. Labor is a kind of fermentation process, but one that is instrumentalized from without. There is no wild fermentation that remains wild when there is value to be found in it. Muscles, bones, knowledge, labor interacts with an object, often an atomized commodity, which is combined, separated, subjected, and transformed. This process of reshaping doesn't just happen to the commodity. In fact, the act of laboring rebounds into the labor themselves. Dynamic metabolic exchanges occur between things and people through this labor. Marx speaks of a rift that class society produces between humanity and nature, where our social appetites are characterized through extraction and energy loss, depleting soils and wrecking ecosystems. Returning to the combination landfill and nature park, can you calculate the amount of labor that went into producing the commodities and food waste that now lay buried? How expensive is the ground? Like many factories and sites of production, the subterranean workshop is hidden from view, obscured in this case by trees, grasses, and shrubs, and the methane that flows outward from it. An aging economy is pushing up daisies, forming a nature and a natural for a new generation. Is your vessel a battery? What kind of engine will you power with it, and for whom? Find a landfill, sit in it. This is a fermentation crock on a major scale, filling the container of the earth with more and more gases.
So during my research for this project, I got really excited about these kind of magical cure-all food scrap essays on the internet. There's kind of like a wonderful weird corner where it's like lemon peels, it'll give you magic health benefits. And I kind of loved the way that they were kind of treating food scraps as this like potent thing. And through that research, I decided I wanted to do something with the food scraps of pumpkins. During this season, a lot of people put pumpkins on their doorsteps, and as soon as it gets cold, they all kind of find their way to the landfill. So I went on my local Buy Nothing group, and you might actually recognize this jam from the broken vessel that Celia had shared earlier. But yeah, I gathered pumpkins, and what you see on the table is everything I was able to find, and I was very humbled by how much food one pumpkin yields, and just thinking about all of the waste that we could kind of like reuse and prevent from turning into landfill scrap.
Here's some ideas for composting your leftovers. As Jasmine said, you can use lemon rinds or watermelon and candy them or pickle them. You can use natural dyes such as onion skins and avocado, like Celia used in the placemats. You can use it for skincare, exfoliants, and chicken feed. Or in this case, as you see in the photo, I'm holding this avocado seed that I decided to experiment with and give it a chance to see if it could regrow life, and it did. I did this by providing it a source of nutrients and wrapped it in paper towel. And there was a lot of patience involved as well, because I was about to give up after about a couple months, and then it wasn't until 4 months that I started to see little roots grow.
So to kind of circle back around to the beginning, a lot of our thinking has not only been about literally learning about fermentation processes, but looking to them as models for collectivity and thinking through how we can model our relationships to each other. So the following is an excerpt from a letter that I wrote to Jessica last November that has been reworked, sort of following conversations with the whole group. Donna Haraway writes about the function of models in science. A model is a work object. A model is worked, and it does work. A model is like a miniature cosmos. What kind of models can we look to as cultural producers then, in order to do our work of being together and of producing meaningfully from our collective body? What might these models help us to articulate about the boundaries between ourselves and others and the potential that lies in between? The first model I looked to is a SCOBY, a symbiotic community of bacteria and yeast. As defined by Sandor Elix Katz in his book, The Art of Fermentation, a SCOBY is a starter culture that has taken on a physical form, which is transferred from batch to batch as a means of perpetuation. Certain fermentation starters have evolved into distinctive biological forms that reproduce themselves as cohesive communities. Organisms coordinate their reproduction and spin their shared skin. And it's this notion of skin which draws me. The choreography of bodies and schedules and production, a shared investment in certain results. We, GRAFT, as a collection of human beings, have formed a kind of skin around ourselves and named it. We've spoken about and made work about the effort of maintaining this body, the coordinated labor of being in relation and producing, of keeping each other afloat. The SCOBY model of collectivity thrives on difference. Katz describes multi-stage fermentation processes in which different bacteria adopt tasks based on their own strengths and work on a staggered schedule, each picking up where the last has left off, each creating a more hospitable environment for those who follow. The skin is a permeable and reciprocal membrane. We become a recognizable entity through our work, and the objects of our labor reflect back into us. This is true of our cultural labor as a collective and of our many projects and relations in everyday life. As a SCOBY, the body graft is dropped into the crock, the kitchen, the studio, and we produce something recognizable. We act as a culture in the sense of culturing materials around ourselves, transforming what is at hand to reproduce a specific culture, one that is legible because we are embedded in it. At the same time, I must recognize that we are porous. There isn't a hard boundary around us where other collaborators, family, community haven't seeped in at one point or another. Our collective body wouldn't survive without this kind of outside contamination. A vacuum would render us lifeless. There's nothing special or particular about our practice as artists to move in collective bodies this way. This is the condition for life, utterly human and utterly inhuman at the same time. If we affect the environment into which we are dropped by culturing, then surely our own chemical composition has undergone a sea change in equal measure.
Sorry, I keep forgetting to unmute myself. So I guess to wrap it up and try to tie it together, put everything into a little box. We've been thinking about how to move forward, and fortunately, we've had some really cool help moving forward. We're working on a website at the moment where the entire archive of all of this work is going to be stored. That will hopefully be up sometime in the next 6 months. Building a website's hard, turns out. And beyond that, we're also really excited because we're working on a book with the design lab class here at Concordia. Shout out to those kids. They're doing great work. Very excited about it. Yeah, sorry. The book's really cool. I want to talk about the book a little bit more because we were having a lot of conversations about how do you represent something that is in motion, that's kind of constantly changing, or resist being pinned down in particular ways, in the ways that like a book will, right? It puts things in a linear fashion, and maybe that's something that we're interested in getting away from. And the design team for this book came up with a really great idea, which was having recipes on individual cards that you could sort of shuffle, and you could reorganize the book, much like we're trying to think about reordering time. It's something that we're really excited about, and it should be up pretty soon.
December.
Yeah, December, January, somewhere in there. Fingers crossed that they get through the mail okay.
So that brings us to the end. We just wanted to extend our warmest thanks to Sika, specifically to Maya, and to Joni Chung, who is the coordinator for our residency. To Fourth Space, thank you, Anna and Doug. Miriam, Elmira, Elizabeth, Rihanna, and Isadora, who are publication designers. Ned Zimmerman, who's been helping us resolve a lot of these same questions about the website design. Design Lab at Concordia, and then all of you who are here in person and online, thanks so much.
Thank you.
And here's an excerpt from our bibliography, if anyone is interested.
Love a talk that ends in a bibliography. That's speaking of like more vessels, right?
Yeah.
Nice. Thank you so much for those remarks, GRAFT, Cecilia and Danny, and Beth and Jessica and Jasmine. We have time now, everybody, for some questions, discussion points. So I feel as though I need to also invite everybody to come out of your reverie. I've definitely been hypnotized by watching the food prepared in front of me, and the at times, and I would say most of the time, very poetic discussion you led about this project. And I wonder if I can maybe be selfish and start with a question. Now that I've cued everybody to think of wants to contribute, either again in the chat or at our little speaker's corner that Anna mentioned. And it is a question that relates to the dissemination of your work. I appreciate how you talked about the logistics of using the mail, especially sometimes when things broke, because we sometimes forget the physical material journeying of things we put in the post. Also, the challenges of trying to publish a work that toys with time, stretches it, experiments with it, but in something that is linear, like a book or a website. And I'm thinking about recent shows that use exhibition spaces for fermentation processes. And I'm thinking of Fermentation Feminisms, which was a recent show at Critical Distance in Toronto. Other iterations that I've seen in research on food and commensality, which is an interest of mine also. So I'm like really taking notes on your work. do you, like, are there certain ways of dissemination that you absolutely would not consider because of the politics of the space of attention, or what that means in terms of an audience? Because the mail art is a very specific, like, heritage of democratizing the way mail is sent and encountered. A book and a website also can be seen in that way, of multiples of access. So I'm curious about discussions you might be having of dissemination and what the politics are of that for you as a collective.
One thing I'll say right off the bat is that I don't think we've ever, as a group of just within our own personal installation practice, I don't think we've ever made a thing that people were not supposed to touch or interact with or use. I think the only boundary I can imagine around exhibiting work like this is having something that's clean and sterile, because it's really antithetical to the idea. But
I think also a lot of the work that we've done is like really performance based, or like installation based, or like really ephemeral. And so this is such a like an ephemeral project that it's always been a challenge for us to figure out a way to repackage and represent like our really ephemeral work for further and future consumption. So this project might be at our best success at that, at documenting and re-representing such a like an ephemeral project.
Yeah, I feel like going forward, it could be interesting to have like a message board. Just something, I mean, like something that keeps moving. Because otherwise, I mean, it always kind of turns into like a static object, or it runs the risk of turning into a static object. Maybe all things do, but that could be an interesting like way to engage, and maybe something we could expand off of with the website that we're building. But that's just a thought off the top of my head.
Well, and I think it's an exercise in frustration when you have so much to communicate and you're never going to be able to communicate all of it. And I think that's something that happens in a project like this, where everything you do gets rolled into it. And on the one hand, it gives you material for expressing it through these different outlets, but you're always going to be leaving something out. And I don't know, maybe that's just a good exercise in reconciling yourself to the sort of limitations of communication and the limitations of exhibition practices and media.
Yeah, absolutely. And those limitations can be active decisions because of what you said about the invitation or the need to touch or consume. So yeah, I appreciate that as an answer. Any questions from those assembled, or reflections if you want to share your ferments? That's definitely a vocabulary word I'm going to now use on a regular basis. Your ferment. I like how you just referred to things as the ferment.
We would love to see your ferments. Yeah.
I brought a ferment that I made a couple weeks ago. It's just some red cabbage and ginger, and it was sitting in my kitchen for a couple weeks, and it's really good. Oh, I see some ferments in the.
Oh,
Yay.
nice.
The cat?
What vegetables do you use?
We use turnip and carrot and garlic.
Mmm.
Tasty.
Question. Actually, we had a question about how much like this weight didn't have like a normal weight, so I made this like contraption. But can we just put the lid on top of it now, or does it need the weight still?
It needs some.
I always make weird contraption lids. Like I often like put some water in a different jar and then use that to kind of pack it in and as a weight. I wouldn't put the lid on yet. I would cover it with a napkin and wait a little bit.
Because there's going to be all the bacteria are going to be exhaling an incredible amount of gas. And so if it's too sealed and air can't escape, then it's like you're making this little pipe bomb. So it kind of like will kind of start spitting juices out the side, and it's exciting. But also I would recommend putting like a plate or a bowl or some tray underneath your ferments, because there probably will be leakage at some point.
I was about to say the same thing. I made accidentally like red cabbage popsicles at some point last summer because the brine just overflowed secretly on top of my fridge and went straight into the freezer. And then I opened the freezer door eventually, and there was just a row of them.
It's kind of beautiful though.
It was very beautiful.
Yeah.
One tip that I wanted to add when you're doing your fermentation, since it's so new, like you'll probably trap some air bubbles in your chopped vegetables. So you can use a spoon to kind of agitate the vegetables and make sure you pop all those bubbles before you seal it.
On another pragmatic note, since you're using garlic, it's really common for garlic to turn bright blue when it's fermenting, and it doesn't mean that it's bad. It's just a chemical reaction that creates a very beautiful color.
It tastes good.
Yeah, I'll also say
You can
like,
still eat it when it's blue.
I'm sorry. Maybe I just had a technical issue. But yeah, I'll just say I think it's a really great practice to just play, like experiment. There's lots of room for failure. It happens kind of a lot. I think we all share different failures, but I think through that failure, you end up like learning the most. So I've definitely had some pretty bad ferments in this process, but that's how you make the good ones.
During this project, I made a fermented hot sauce, and I did witness the calm yeast that Beth had mentioned earlier, or the white film that was growing on top. And I was really scared and nervous at first because I had done so much work to chop all these serrano peppers, and you know, I thought that the whole batch would have been breached altogether. But I think what I feel like I could have done differently during that fermentation process is like, if you don't like the calm yeast, because it can tend to make your ferments bitter, you can always scoop it out rather than shaking your jar to avoid that bitterness.
Oh,
There's
someone
an
just asked in the chat.
Yes,
sorry.
I was just going to preempt that, Beth. I'll help you so you don't have to keep eyes on so many different things. There's a question in the chat from Isabel Parson, who is an MFA student here, and it expands on something that you just spoke to, which is how we learn from failures and ferments in one of her questions. But there's a series of them here where she's asking about the relationship between you and the ferment. What have you learned about yourself? Is it an extension, excuse me, is it an extension of yourself? Are you depressed when it doesn't work? Are you aware of your productivity and the success of your attempts? A lot of questions there. Maybe we can start with the relationship to the ferment. Specifically, I mean, on the one hand, there's the practical aspect of doing what you have on hand or what's come to harvest. But then there's the other, perhaps sentimental, nostalgic, intergenerational traditions of ferment.
I guess I will share. So my relationship with my ferment was an interesting one, one that was confusing, mysterious in all the ways that I just didn't, you know, feel like I knew a lot about this process, but I did find that every day that I checked on my ferment, you know, because I had to loosen the screw of the jar to release the air, I felt like it was very nurturing. I was taking care of this this baby that I was, you know, caring for, and it was a lot of high maintenance because I, you know, added that into my daily life, and it was hard to explain to people, you know, it's like, this is just something I have to do. So it was an interesting time.
Yeah, it is like having like a little, it's a living thing. So you're having a little good caretaking relationship with it. And it's also, you know, it's like you get to see this invisible life form have these visible effects. So you're like seeing the bubbles and like you're tasting the changes. And so it's like these tiny things made visible, which is really interesting.
Yeah, to piggyback off of that, I feel like Beth had spoken about this in the talk, but we're sanitizing everything, and we've got this kind of antimicrobial attitude right now because of COVID. And so it also felt really nice to like care for life in a tender way that was microbial, that was kind and nonviolent to it, you know?
And then eat it.
And then eat it, which is, I guess, violent and bad for it.
You know, it's so cool when all those things interact with your gut microbiome and diversify and enrich it. And it's really fascinating.
I do think I kind of freaked out my roommates a little bit because there was always something growing in a cabinet or receiving something and then eating it. And that was a fun aspect of this.
I will just say also as a practice of time and routine and again, maintenance, it became really meaningful to me. I mean, I think like many of us, I got kind of obsessively about home projects because of just being forced to be at home all the time, and having a thing that felt caring and intentional and that actually required my attention every day really opened that into a nurturing space. It made it feel like a space of possibility and choice rather than being trapped.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I will add that I feel like this project was an extension of myself. It allowed me to have the opportunity for sort of like a cultural exploration. I didn't mention in the slideshow, but I also worked with sweet potatoes, specifically like a Korean variety of sweet potatoes that my mom used to roast all the time. And so I really wanted to use that ingredient to then share with GRAFT.
That strikes me as a particular hospitality, Jessica, that there's sometimes family recipes or traditions that can be guarded, especially in a like professional food industry capacity. Recipes are often tied to capital. So to share them in this particular context as an invitation into knowing and the intergenerational tradition is, I think, part of, like, that's how I understood the way you were binding together this concept of mail art and fermentation, which I definitely want to go home and think about ferment. That's a bridging that makes complete sense, but I think has a lot of interesting implications of what that could mean. And Megan Quigley in the chat has a similar kind of question about branching. Megan asks, I'm interested in your relationship to skill sharing and teaching in this project. Absolutely. Have you done other workshops? And is there a desire to expand beyond the brackets closed, but not in a bad way, network of your collective? Is a score a skill sharing methodology?
That's a great question.
One of the workshops that we did, I invited everyone to learn Szechuan chili oil. And actually it was something that I hadn't made before, but so my dad, you know, I grew up eating a lot of Chinese food. So it was an interesting way to curate this workshop because I provided all of the ingredients that I sought after, which was actually really difficult because I had to go to a couple different stores to find them. They weren't, you know, available at your regular grocery store. But we did the workshop over Zoom. And so there was, I don't know if there was a lot of technical difficulties, but it was very different from just inviting people over and demonstrating live. So
you created these amazing little packages too that were just so beautiful. I feel like it was a really smart way to do that kind of workshop. And I do think we're interested in like reaching broader audiences and including different people. Like this knowledge is non-proprietary, and we want to share it. And that's always been a big part of our kind of collective practice. Also, is kind of going beyond the collective.
And,
actually, it was.
I'm sorry. Go for it, Celia.
Oh, I was just going to say that I feel like actually jumping headfirst into something that we're all amateurs at is sort of a trademark approach of our collective. So there's also this idea about maybe like like a self-pedagogy where at least I feel like I learn best when I'm learning with others and kind of working through problems together. And maybe that's not always in person, but I'm not just sort of like chewing on a problem by myself. And I know it's not like special to me. That's probably most people. Yeah, we used to host a lot of workshops at the space too, and I think skill sharing and like it's really a big part of the kind of DIY ethos, right? Is you learn something and then you immediately pass it on to other people, and
like a raccoon. Like the Toronto raccoon.
the Toronto raccoon who
Yeah.
learned about the raccoon proof. Do people know what I'm talking about? The city of Toronto spent so much money on these raccoon proof trash cans, and then there was just like one brilliant raccoon who had a name. I don't remember her name. She learned how, and then she taught all her children how to open the special raccoon proof trash cans. And then there was like, they were tracking it, and it was like successive rings spreading out from the one neighborhood where the really smart raccoon lived, where like they were all skill sharing with each other.
Oh my God, amazing.
I'm trying to look up a link to this article to share it, and my Google results are very, yeah, that's, I'm not gonna do that right now.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess speaking of fermentations, it's probably not a bad idea to goof the algorithm a little bit, right?
True,
Yeah.
yes, absolutely. Speaking, I mean, in a way of goofing the process, there's a question that I'm really curious about hearing an answer to by Elise Grigio. Was there anything that you fermented that you thought might be slightly nasty, but were surprised with it being good?
I made a fruit shrub, which is like you ferment it with apple cider vinegar, so it's sort of like a mixture between wild fermentation and a little bit of an added culture because of the vinegar mother. But I made it with ground cherries, which I thought was going to be gross, but felt compelled to do because I was like, what is like the most overlooked local fruit that I could use for this project? And they were surprisingly good to me. I can't speak for anyone else.
I made like a pine-soaked vinegar, apple cider vinegar that was just incredibly weird. I don't know, like it kind of, sometimes it would neutralize and be better, like, but it's just gotten very dark in color. I still have it. I can't really like go through it that much, but it is good. It's just really intense. So that's probably my weirdest one.
Actually, Jasmine, the salted egg.
Oh, the salted egg.
Not forget the salted egg.
Can't forget the salted egg. Yeah, so my then roommate gave me a recipe for making salt cured eggs where you lay certain eggs to rest in a pile of salt for several weeks. And it basically turns into like a Parmesan cheese type thing, but it was weird. And it was like a little lemony and zesty, but it was weird. I liked it. I ate it. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it, actually. Like, it was just kind of strange, but it was cool.
I don't know how
If you're not
I
raised
felt
eating
about those
fermented
eggs
foods,
either.
it's an acquired taste. So it's I found like an adjustment to like my taste buds encountering some of these flavors is mostly from like food that's gone bad, and so it's a good kind of adjustment to realize that what I'm eating isn't bad food. It's just like this is the funky bacteria stuff that's actually tasty, and it's like grows on you after a time.
Speaking of the salted egg, so I remember when Jazmyn, I think it was interesting that you used like a muslin cloth to wrap this egg in because it was like a mummy, just preserved.
Yes.
I mean, mummies are preserved in salt. It's the same process. I think that's really interesting.
The cultural connections that you make are really fascinating with this project. I think there's so much. I'm really looking forward to seeing how that might be contained in the book project as well. And we have two more questions. There's a question in the chat from Jordan, but we also, and I'm really relishing what I'm about to say, have a question from our studio audience. So Camille, I understand that you are on the other side of the screen and you want to ask a question. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
First of all, I want to say thank you for the presentation and the workshop. It's really appreciated. And I have a small question. I was wondering if the project prompted any personal changes regarding your social habits, your definition of hospitality, or your definition of relationship?
That sounds like a very good research creation kind of a question.
I think this project, it was in a really dark time, I think, for a lot of us, because it was, fall of 2020. And so, just on a personal level and a collective level, it was kind of like a lifeline to have an excuse and a project to like connect with each other on a really constant basis, like whether it's, Zoom calls to kind of talk about the project, or, constantly thinking about making things for one another. So that was just really important for me during that like really, really rough time last year. I don't know if that really answered the question, but maybe think of that.
It's such a beautiful question. Like I do think we were kind of like hosting each other in this interesting way and kind of keeping each other afloat, as well as keeping these various life forms afloat. And I think personally, it's really trickled into my own art practice in all these surprising and cool ways, and kind of changed some of my research. And I think because it's been so tied to my lived experience, it's really affected a lot of things on a level that's hard to even quite pinpoint. Like, it's been pretty profound.
I would say a lot of my kind of personal interests tended towards like beverages. I was thinking a lot through shrubs and vinegar, and thinking about sort of histories around fermenting alcohol as well. And sort of the lineage of hospitality and how we culturally define that concept, and the ways that in so many cultures it was actually not just something that was a responsibility, but a duty. Like it's not optional. You take care of other people, you feed other people, you welcome other people when they need to be welcomed. And kind of just thinking through how it's something that is so casual but like carries so much historical and cultural baggage at the same time, and trying to locate just like the thing that you're sharing with your friend at the park within that lineage.
I will add that for me, I come from a Korean and Chinese background, and because I was able to explore these certain ingredients, it kind of allowed me to have these new conversations with my parents. I was from Albuquerque and I moved to Louisville just 4 months before the pandemic. So I solely relied on telephone or video for communication. And I was able to share with them this project and explore all these specific ingredients. I thought it was really interesting because I, did a lot of research on the internet about the Szechuan peppercorn, and to try to prepare for the Szechuan chili oil workshop. And I remember having a conversation with my dad, asking him how he makes Szechuan chili oil. And, he would tell me how he did it, and, heating this oil and using all these ingredients to infuse all the things that you use. And then I would say, well, actually, I found on the internet that you can do it this way, or, and so like he was really surprised that I had so much knowledge that he hadn't shared and passed down to me. And so it was a really interesting new way to interact with my parents in that way.
There's one more question that we're going to sneak in before the turn of the hour, and it relates to things that you learned during this process. There's a question from Jordan. You experimented with small-scale home fermentation, and I think specifically with these intimate lineages that you just explained. And he asks, in your research, did you learn anything about mass production of fermented foods?
I immediately think of those, like in Westerns, like the big, huge pickle barrels, but I don't know. I'm curious if Danny did any research about that, or Celia.
Well, I'm just going to jump in about bog butter. This is my chance.
Gotta get it in there.
So bog butter is a sort of pet research interest of ours. I feel like at least once a year, one of us will remember about bog butter. Basically, it's something dating back to, I think it's like something that pops up a lot in Ireland and archaeology. Like they'll just dig up a cask of butter that's dating back to the Iron Age that's just been in the ground that whole time. And I'm not talking like a personal, like you go to the store and get a pound of butter. They're like pounds and pounds, and like something the size of this table, just buried in the earth, thousands of years, hundreds of years, thousands of years. Some of them are more recent. And the sort of like mystery of why this quantity of butter and why in the ground and why didn't they come back for it. And I know that doesn't really pertain to contemporary processes of large-scale fermentation, but it was really interesting to kind of think about the way that food history comes up in these ways that, you know, you have the materials from a certain time and it's obviously no longer edible, but we really have no idea what people's relationship was to this substance that's still part of our daily lives.
And do you want to talk about the bog butter ritual we did last winter?
Yeah, so I was reading a lot about bog butter. I read all the articles on JSTOR about bog butter, and there are a lot, and they're mostly by the same three scholars. And the hypothesis is really that the bog butter was often buried as like kind of a ritual of boundary markers, or as like buried during moments where there were transitions of power happening. The more recent discoveries, the ones that were buried kind of more within the scale of hundreds of years ago, they think were maybe being hidden because they were valuable, and then people just never came back for them. And then there's also a theory that they were being buried as a longer fermentation process, because the butter that they had back then was like a living, curdling dairy product. It wasn't sweet cream butter the way that we experience it now. It was something that would probably taste rancid to a modern palate. Anyway, all of this is to say that I scripted a bog butter ritual that had to do with, I was very influenced by the sort of analysis I was reading about speculating that these were offerings to the land, that they were really about power and accountability and belonging. And so I asked everyone to go out at some point in midwinter and bury some butter in a secret place. And there was an audio score. It's been sort of translated in video form on the website at this point. Yes, and everyone is invited to partake in the bog butter ritual if they choose. Let me know, I'll email you the video.
Wonderful. I feel like how can we have a parting discussion point better than the invitation for bog butter ritual? I think it's a really wonderful note to end on. And I'll take the opportunity to start a round of thanks before I hand it over to Anna. Thank you, of course, to the GRAFT Collective for taking such time and consideration into how you share the residency project with us. It takes a long time to do a collective talk and also a demo, so really appreciate that labor and sharing with us. Thank you, of course, to the MFA Department of Studio Arts for helping us fund the residency, but also this event, and to Fourth Space for hosting this event. This is the last SICA event of 2021, but not of the season. We will continue into the winter. We'll reconvene in January, and I have just done that very typical hosting gesture of sending you a link to our website where you can sign up for our newsletter. Also, in that sign-up process, we will be happy to share with you the announcement for the book launch of the GRAFT project. So much to look forward to. Have wonderful rest of your ferments. Is that a thing that we can say? But I'm happy to hold it or hand the space back to Anna to close down the Zoom. Thanks, GRAFT.
Thanks, GRAFT, and thanks, Maya. Thanks to
everyone.
the folks who've joined us here in person as well and on Zoom. I will admit that we do 1, 2, or 3 events per day, and I've never eaten so much during an event I just kept eating this entire time. I heard something about pickles being passed around, perhaps, before we leave. I don't know, but I'm sticking around for it. All right, so on that note, happily, I guess it's dinner time, apparently, for us all. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today, and we hope to see you again in January, as Maya suggested. Otherwise, check us out at Concordia University Fourth Space for daily events. All right, have a great night. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Always on a screen somewhere.
Okay, bye guys. I gotta go to work. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I'll be sliding into your email inboxes. So this won't be the last. You'll hear from me.
Okay, cool.
We look forward.
It was a promise, not a threat.